This is a piece of a stone wall that I made out of plaster recently, and this is the problem with plaster. So today we're on a quest to find an unbreakable plaster. Plaster is a great material. It's cheap and it's non-toxic, and lately I've been wondering if it could be used as an alternative to resin for making casts. The only real problem is how fragile it is. I don't want to worry that the stuff I build will break when it's knocked over on the gaming table or when it's thrown into a box for storage. So in this video I'm gonna use this silicone mold to make 5 different versions of this wall section, and in the end of the video I'll break them apart to see which one is strongest. Let's get started. Plaster is super easy to work with. All you need is some plaster and some water. Let me show you. People say you should always mix plaster into water and not the other way around, because apparently it helps prevent lumps and gives a more even consistency. When you're mixing plaster, it's all about getting the consistency right. If you don't add enough water, the plaster can't get into all the nooks and crannies in the mold, but the more water you add, the weaker the plaster becomes. I prefer a mix that's around the point where the plaster is self-leveling. You have to be careful not to wait too long before pouring the plaster, otherwise it'll start to set. Here I'm spraying the silicone mold with soapy water, which will help the plaster get into all the crevices and prevent air bubbles getting trapped. You can see the plaster is a little bit lumpy here. I should have mixed it better. In this case it's not a problem because the back of the wall section is supposed to be hidden, but it would be nicer if the plaster was easier to mix. I'll shake the mold to help release air bubbles and to level out the surface. There's a little too much plaster in the mold, so I scrape off the excess, and then I leave it to dry. After about half an hour, the plaster is hard enough to demold the cast. You can still feel that it's cool and slightly damp, but it's solid enough that you can paint it already and you don't have to wait for it to cure completely, which would take a couple of days, before you can use it in your terrain. So those are the basics of using plaster to make casts. That was easy enough, right? By the way, if you want me to make a video on how I made the master and the mold for this wall section, let me know in the comments. According to the manufacturer, regular plaster has a strength of 5 megapascals. This next plaster has a strength of 40 megapascals, so it should be 8 times stronger than the standard plaster. I'm gonna call this a medium strength plaster because we have an even stronger one coming up. Regular plaster is pretty forgiving to work with. You don't normally have to be super exact with the ratio of water to plaster. I haven't tried these high-strength plasters before, so I don't know how easy they are to work with. The different plasters have different ratios of water to plaster, and I don't know how sensitive they are, so I might mess them up. We'll find out. To get the best result, I want to be as accurate as possible, so I'm using my digital scales. The instructions weirdly give a ratio of weight to volume, which is a bit confusing. It's immediately clear that this is much easier to mix than the regular plaster, but the default ratio of water to plaster makes it too thick for what we want. You can see how it holds its shape here, which makes it more difficult to get it to flow into all the nooks and crannies in the mold, so I'll add a little more water. This is great. It's a lot more smooth and creamy than the regular plaster. So this is kind of interesting. Plaster is hard, but there's water on top. I've never seen that before with regular plaster. It doesn't seem to affect the cast though. Yeah, this is a very nice cast. Next up is the strongest plaster. This one has a strength of 80 pascals, which means it should be twice as strong as the medium plaster and 16 times as strong as regular plaster. Both of these high-strength plasters cost about 2.5 times as much as the regular plaster. Regular plaster is pretty cheap to begin with, so it's definitely worth it if we can find a plaster that won't break. Interestingly, the stronger the plaster, the less water you need. Looks and feels the same as the medium-strength plaster. Like the previous one, this also needed a little more water for what we're doing. I probably even could have added a bit more. I forgot to spray the mold with water before I added the plaster. It was also a little on the thick side, so this is what happens. We get a lot of tiny air bubbles in the cast. But wow, this is really strong already. Here I'm adding some PVA glue to the water. The idea is that the glue will strengthen the plaster from the inside and make it less liable to break. And then I'll mix it with regular plaster. I've previously tried painting diluted PVA glue onto cured plaster, which the plaster will absorb, and that does give it a little extra strength, but not that much. So I have high hopes for this technique. Plaster and PVA glue both dry by water evaporation, so it should work, but there might be an issue with how fast they each take to dry. One issue I'm finding is that it's more difficult to dissolve the lumps when I've added the PVA glue. There's also a lot more bubbles. This seems to dry slower than usual, and I think the reason is that the PVA glue is trapping the moisture inside the plaster. It might be forming a seal around the piece and prevent the moisture from escaping. If we look at the back of the wall section made with PVA glue, you can see all the lumps and bubbles and texture. The front looks fine, but of course the rocks are supposed to have some texture. What happens if we mix regular plaster with higher strength plaster? This is 80 megapascals. This is 5 megapascals. So the question is, will we get something at around 40 megapascals if we mix them? The good stuff costs about 2.5 times more than the regular stuff, so we could potentially save a couple of bucks if it works. Okay, the instruction says that it can take up to 8 days for the plaster to cure completely, so I'll let them sit for a week or two. It's been around 10 days, so the plaster should be bone dry by now. I noticed something interesting. You can actually hear the difference between the different types of plaster. Listen to this. Anyways, if you look at the standard plaster, it's fairly rough and it has a lot of texture. If you compare that to the strong plaster, you can tell just by looking at it that it's a lot smoother. It clearly feels a lot smoother and a lot more solid. In my experience, plaster tends to get damaged fairly quickly on a wargaming table. So the question is, does a stronger plaster equal a more durable paint job? Let me show you how I paint these and then we can find out. I'll use a warm palette of tan colors as well as black and white. I'll water down all the paints to a wash consistency. I'll start by applying the dark brown as the base color. You can see the wash being absorbed by the plaster almost instantly. Then it's simply a question of painting the stones one by one. The cool thing is you don't need to be neat here. You just have to make sure you cover each stone completely. The only trick is to switch up the colors so you don't get too many stones of the same color next to one another. Since the washes are quite thin, we'll get some lovely color variation. Then I go over some of the stones again, painting the top in a lighter color or the bottom in a darker color, which will give us some nice highlights and another level of color variation. I love this look and it's a really fast process. It only took 6 minutes to paint this wall section from start to finish. Now we have all this empty space between the stones and we'll fill it up to make mortar joints using more plaster. To create the mortar joints, I just dump a bunch of plaster on the wall section and push it into all the gaps with a paintbrush, and then I just clean off the excess powder. Once I'm satisfied, I add some water to the plaster. The plaster will sink into the gaps unevenly, giving it a warm and weathered look. If that's too much, you can smooth it out with a damp paintbrush. If you want it to look even more weathered, you can apply some washes, but I'll leave it as it is. I want to test if there's any difference in how different types of plaster take paint, especially if the harder ones will absorb the paint like regular plaster or if the surface is too hard. I'm not sure if adding all that water to the plaster might weaken it, so I only apply it to a cornerstone of each wall section so it won't interfere with the break test later on. While there is a noticeable difference in how fast the plasters absorb the paint, luckily they all still absorb the paint within a few seconds, so the same painting technique can be used on all of them. After they've had some time to dry, the standard plaster is still pretty soft, so you can easily damage it. The one with PVA glue mixed in isn't much better. Unfortunately, neither is the medium strength plaster or the mix of two plasters. However, the strong plaster seems to be pretty resistant to scratches, which is promising. I can live with that. It doesn't feel like I'm scraping off a layer of plaster like it does with the regular stuff, so it might just be the paint that's coming off. Now it's time for what we've all been waiting for. The break test. The standard plaster, like the one I showed in the intro, is easily broken. No surprise there. The regular plaster mixed with PVA glue is definitely stronger than the regular plaster on its own, but it's still not very durable. I'm a little disappointed actually. Still, if you can live with the drawbacks, I think it's worth doing. The medium strength plaster is a good step up from the regular plaster. Comparatively, it's a lot stronger than the regular stuff, but unfortunately it's not unbreakable. The mix between the high strength and the low strength plaster is surprisingly a little bit weaker than the medium strength plaster. And finally, the high strength plaster. Not unbreakable either, but it's definitely not weak. A small piece like this I can't actually break. So while it's not unbreakable, it's still a huge step up from the standard plaster. But is it worth the extra cost? It's much easier to work with, it has a smoother consistency, and it's a lot more durable. So for me, it's absolutely worth it. None of these plasters will completely replace resin, even the strongest one is just too brittle, but I can see some cases where they might. In the end, we didn't manage to find an unbreakable plaster, but we did find a solution that will make our terrain a lot more durable. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.